I was 10 years old the first time something possessed me. It wasn't a demon. It was my own body, and it had opinions that summer. Hair, acne, a voice that cracked without warning. My summer of nightmares started with strange, unsettling dreams and ended with a body that I didn't fully recognize as my own anymore. This episode isn't really about The Exorcist. I didn't even see the film until years after everyone else already had. I grew up in a very small town with no video store to wander into on a Friday night. If you missed a film in the theater, you missed it. Sometimes for years, sometimes for good. So the thing that actually got its hands on me first wasn't Friedkin's camera or anyone else's special effects. It was a paperback, a vinyl record, and a preteen body that had already stopped taking instructions from me. Everything else in this episode, the film itself, the CBS broadcast, 50 years of ghost stories about a cursed set, all of that comes later, and some of it's going to surprise you. But that's not where this actually starts. Buckle in, everyone. This one's going to get personal fast. The Exorcist came out in December of 1973, oddly enough on the day after Christmas. I was a typical 9-year-old monster kid, and I wanted to see what all the fuss was about. I was correctly not allowed to go anywhere near it by my parents. They had more sense than that, whatever else you may want to say about them. Of course, that didn't stop me from ingesting everything else I could possibly find about the movie and its subject matter. And we all know you can't stop a determined 10-year-old from reading. And that's exactly what I was the summer I turned 10, August 1974, when I got my hands on the novelization. I got my hands on a dog-eared copy from a friend, and I can still see it in my mind's eye. The cover was a deep purple color with a haunting, blurry, sepia-toned photo of a young girl's distorted face. That book really got to me. Not the film, but the book. I need you to sit with that distinction for a moment because it matters more than anything else in this episode. The thing that actually did damage to me wasn't Friedkin's camera, it wasn't Dick Smith's amazing makeup, and it wasn't a single special effect. It was William Peter Blatty's prose, unfiltered, straight into the head of a 10-year-old boy with absolutely no defenses up against it. And I didn't just read it once. I read it a lot. And I even had a soundtrack for my obsession. And that soundtrack was Tubular Bells, the debut solo album by the English musician Mike Oldfield. The haunting opening piano theme was used as the soundtrack for the film, and it propelled the album to become one of the best-selling British records of all time. My brother had a copy of Tubular Bells, and I played it constantly. Again and again, while reading, building an entire sensory haunted house in my own head with nothing but a paperback and an LP of Tubular Bells from the Columbia House Record and Tape Club. Months and years before I ever saw a single frame of the actual movie. Turns out, imagination doesn't have a special effects budget. It doesn't need one. It'll just take whatever you give it and make it 10 times worse. Here's the part I've never really said out loud before, on a microphone at least. That summer, my body was doing something to me. Changing. Waking up in ways I did not understand and absolutely did not ask for. And underneath the change, underneath the ordinary business of turning 10 and having a body that was starting to have its own agenda, there was something else. A pull that I didn't have a word for yet. A shape of feeling towards other boys I knew, with total 10-year-old clarity, was not supposed to be there. I didn't have any language for any of it. Nobody hands a 10-year-old in small-town South Carolina in 1974 a vocabulary for burgeoning gay kid. What I had instead was a book about a 12-year-old girl whose body got taken over by something else, something demonic. Something that made her say things she'd never say, do things she'd never do, be a person her own mother didn't recognize anymore. And I remember reading it and thinking, oh, that's what this is. Something's got a hold of me. I mean, there were signs. Drastic changes in appearance, speaking in a strange voice, sores, smells, lustful, impure thoughts. What else could it be? There's a scene in the movie Anti-Mame where Rosalind Russell, playing a woman trying to write her own memoir, comes up with the single greatest sentence ever written about growing up. How bleak was my puberty. Tell me about it, sis. The truth of the matter was that nothing was taking control of me. Nothing had gotten in. It was just me. And puberty. But I didn't have any other framework for what guilt and self-loathing and an unwanted, unstoppable want actually felt like at 10, except demonic possession. Reagan didn't choose what was happening to her body. Neither, as far as I could tell, had I. Every other kid on my street was scared of the devil. I was scared that I was the devil. It's a comparatively worse deal. Now, nobody in my house batted an eye at the book itself. I was already the horror kid. That was an established, entirely unremarkable fact about me by 10 years of age, and nobody was especially bothered by it. That paperback sat right out on my nightstand in plain view, next to whatever else I was reading that summer. Nobody ever asked me what was actually going on with a kid who'd read the same 40 pages about a possessed child 11 times in a row, because on the surface, there was nothing to ask. It was just Barry being Barry, into the scary stuff again. Which meant whatever the book was actually doing to me underneath all that, that part stayed entirely mine. Nobody was policing the book, so nobody was aware of what it had actually reached into. You don't have to hide the exorcism novel when the exorcism novel is, by some distance, the least alarming thing going on with you that summer. I didn't tell anyone what the book was really doing to me because I didn't have the words. And because the one thing worse than being possessed by something you don't understand is admitting out loud that you might actually deserve it. That's the bit I want you to sit with before we go any further. 10 years old, a body starting to become a stranger to me, a pull towards other boys I already knew enough to be frightened of, and a 200-page paperback that gave all of it a shape, even if that shape it gave me was the wrong one. I wouldn't actually see the film itself for another 6 years or so, but the damage, if you want to call it that, and I'm honestly not sure I do anymore, was already done. The book got there first. Which brings us to February 1980. A censored network broadcast, an eager 15-year-old, and a very different kind of reaction waiting for me on the other side of that screen. 6 years. That's how long the gap was between reading that book and actually watching the film. 6 years of being the kid who knew everything about a movie he'd never actually seen. During those 6 years, I had done my homework, though. Every issue of Famous Monsters of Filmland and Fangoria that I could get my hands on. Every scrap of, here's what really happened on set gossip. The fire, the injuries, all of it, years before I had any way of knowing which parts were true and which parts were just good copy. I was a super fan of a film I had yet to see, which is a very specific kind of teenage horror kid condition. And I suspect several of you know exactly what I'm talking about. So, it was Tuesday evening, February 12th, 1980. Just in time for Valentine's Day. CBS Network Television. Which meant that this was not the film. This was the film with its teeth pulled. Director Friedkin himself re-edited it for this broadcast. He even redubbed some of the Demon's lines himself because apparently he wasn't keen on getting Mercedes McCambridge back in a booth. He swapped out the desecrated statue shots for something a little less likely to get the network switchboard lit up with complaints. Even castrated, network-safe, commercial interrupted, the film still got me. That should tell you something. I watched it alone. No parents in the room to see my face doing whatever it was doing. No siblings to perform bravado in front of. Just me and a television and 6 years of anticipation finally getting paid off. And here's the thing I want to be honest about. It wasn't the possession that got me this time. I'd already done that work. The book had already taught a 10-year-old boy everything he needed to know about a body turning against itself. What got me watching the actual film years later, older, was something quieter. There was just this palpable sense of evil that sat over the whole thing. It wasn't a jump scare, not a single image, just this overall weather system of dread. Of course, I was thoroughly, gloriously grossed out by the whole thing, and that night I did sleep with the lights on. 15 years old, mind you, well past that age you're supposed to be able to admit that sort of thing to anyone. Of course, I didn't tell a soul at the time, but I'm telling you now, 40-odd years later, on a podcast. Growth. But there was something else happening in me while I watched, and it's the reason I'm standing here today talking to you with a career's worth of latex under my fingernails. I wasn't just scared, I was paying attention. Because by then, I already knew the name Dick Smith, and I already knew this was his work, and watching it finally, properly on a screen, even a heavily edited network cut, I understood maybe for the first time that someone had built this. That the welts rising on Reagan's stomach, the head doing that thing heads aren't meant to do, the vomit, none of that was an accident or magic or luck. It was engineering, craft even. A person with hands figuring out how to make impossible things look absolutely true. And it wasn't just Dick Smith's hands doing the engineering. That demon voice you've been hearing under Reagan the whole time isn't Linda Blair. And it was never meant to be. It's actually Mercedes McCambridge. 57 years old, an Oscar winner, a woman who'd already had a full career before Friedkin ever called her. Swallowing raw eggs, chain smoking, and drinking whiskey to wreck her own vocal cords on purpose. She even went as far to ask to be physically tied to a chair during the recordings so she'd sound like something actually fighting to get out. And when the film came out, she got no credit. It took the Screen Actors Guild stepping in before Warner Brothers put her name on it. Same lesson, different department. It wasn't a demon doing that voice. It was a 57-year-old professional destroying her own instrument on purpose, and nobody even wanted to say her name afterwards. Now, Dick Smith didn't just make me scared that night. He handed a 15-year-old horror kid the first real inklings of a career. Foam latex applied in small sections instead of one solid mask, so an actor could still act underneath it. A mechanical dummy for the head spin, because you don't ask a child actor's neck to do that. A pipe rig for the vomit, and even that had a twist Friedkin cooked up himself. He told actor Jason Miller that the soup would hit him in the chest. They rehearsed it that way so Miller wouldn't brace for it. Then they had them aim it at his face during the actual take. That look of genuine, horrified disgust on Miller in the final film isn't acting. That is a grown man getting ambushed by pea soup on purpose. None of it was cheating. All of it was craft. Some of it kind, some of it a little bit evil. And craft was a thing you could apparently learn and do and get paid for. I didn't know it that night, but that's probably the exact moment that horror fan started quietly filling paperwork to become horror professional. Which is where this episode has to take a turn. Because the story of this film's production has its own reputation. You've heard it. The cursed set. The fire. The deaths. Some of it's true. A lot of it isn't quite what it's been sold as, though. And separating the two tells you almost as much about how horror mythology gets built as the film itself does. Here's something I only clocked doing the research for this episode. In 1980, the year I finally saw the film, a Canadian book called Michelle Remembers came out. It was a memoir that made some very dubious claims. A psychiatrist and his patient, who he later married, which should tell you something on its own, claimed she recovered buried memories of being tortured by a satanic cult as a child. There was no evidence. None. Her own father and sisters went on record saying it had never happened. But it didn't matter. The book sold, it toured, it got on the Oprah circuit, and it became the founding document of what we now look back and call the Satanic Panic. Daycare workers accused of ritual abuse with zero evidence. Dungeons and Dragons blamed for teenage suicides. Even backwards masking of satanic messages in heavy metal music. The FBI eventually looked into all of it and found nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not one tunnel, not one cult. I want you to notice what's happening here, because it's the entire argument of this episode from a different angle. A 15-year-old watches a film about a girl whose body gets taken over by something evil and reads it as a metaphor for something happening inside himself. Meanwhile, an entire country was doing the exact same thing at the exact same time at a national scale, taking something internal, something psychological, something with a much more mundane explanation and deciding it must be something external. Demonic, occult, anything but the plainer, sadder truth. Mine was, a queer kid doesn't have language yet for what he's feeling. Theirs was, a moral panic doesn't have language yet for how common actual child abuse really is, so it invents a more exciting monster instead. Same instinct, wildly different stakes. Which brings me to the production of this film itself, because this got its own version of exactly this. The Cursed Set Story. You've heard some version of it. The fire, the injuries, the deaths. The idea that this film was somehow made by something evil, not just about it. And I went digging because half of what gets repeated about this shoot has calcified into gospel over 50 years, and some of it's true, and some of it is absolutely not. And I think you deserve to know which is which. What is real? First of all, a fire did tear through the interior sets of the McNeil house. It was caused by a bird flying into a circuit box. Not a demon, not a possessed bird, just a bird. It took 6 weeks to rebuild, and yes, Reagan's bedroom was really the only one room left standing, though that's down to where the fire actually started, not where the devil decided to point his finger. Before we move on to the injuries, you need to understand the kind of director Friedkin actually was, because it explains everything that follows better than any curse does. He carried a loaded gun on set and had the prop man fire blanks into the air, unannounced, purely to get genuine, startled flinches out of his actors on camera. There's an early scene where Father Karras turns sharply at a sound in total silence. That reaction is real because Friedkin had just fired a rifle behind him. He did something similar and worse to Father William O'Malley, an actual working priest playing a small role in the film, not a trained actor. Friedkin needed a specific, devastated reaction out of him for the last right scene and wasn't getting it after several takes. So he took O'Malley aside and asked, "Do you trust me?" O'Malley said yes. Friedkin turned away, then hit him full in the face and called action before O'Malley had a chance to recover. O'Malley, a priest, thanked him for it afterwards. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's the same move you're about to hear with Ellen Burstyn, just with a slap instead of a wire. Ask for trust, get it, betray it, get the shot. That's not a curse. That is an asshole director who'd worked out that a real fears and real pain photograph better than acting does, and had no particular interest in the difference. Actress Ellen Burstyn, who played the distraught mother Chris McNeil, did suffer a serious back injury that actually made it into the finished film. She was injured during the intense sequence where the possessed Reagan throws her character across the room and onto the floor. It was real, and by her own account, avoidable. For the stunt, Burstyn was put in a harness attached to a wire and pulled backward. She told Friedkin that the stuntman was already pulling too hard. He said fine, he'd have them ease off. And then, the second she turned away, signaled for the crew to hit her even harder. That's not a curse. That is a director lying to an actor's face to get a better scream. Unfortunately, Linda Blair also fractured her spine while filming the infamous levitating and thrashing scenes. She was strapped into a violently shaking mechanical bed harness that malfunctioned, yanking her with such force that it broke her lower back. The filmmakers left her screams of genuine pain and terror in the final cut of the movie, and she has lived with scoliosis the rest of her life. And yes, there were real deaths during the production. Max von Sydow's brother during the first week on set, Linda Blair's grandfather as well. 2 actors, Jack McGowan and Vasiliki Majoros, both playing characters who die in the story, died before or shortly after filming wrapped. Burstyn herself has said 9 people connected to the production died over the shoot. I want to be honest with you, that number comes from her own recollection in a documentary, not an independently verified death certificate count. Doesn't make it false, just means I'm telling you where it comes from, not treating it as gospel. Here's my favorite bit, though, because it's the whole thesis in miniature, and it's got a twist I only found during the research for this episode. Crew members got spooked enough that Friedkin brought in a Jesuit, Father Thomas Birmingham, who consulted on the film, to do something about that on set. Here's the thing about Birmingham, though. He's not just some priest that the director found in the phone book. Birmingham was Blatty's professor at Georgetown decades earlier. The man who assigned a young William Peter Blatty research on demonic possession as a class project. That assignment is the reason there's a novel at all. There was a real case behind it. In 1949, a 14-year-old boy, not a 12-year-old girl, first in Maryland and then in Missouri. Real scratches that spelled words on his own skin. A priest's arm slashed open with a snapped bedspring during one attempt at exorcism. Newspapers ran it anonymously as Roland Doe. Blatty heard about it as a student and carried it around for over 20 years before he finally sat down and wrote about it. Which means the same man shows up at both ends of this story. He hands a college kid the seed of a novel in the late 1940s. 20-something years later, he's standing on the set of the film that novel became, blessing a spooked crew. Birmingham didn't cause a single thing that happened on this production, but he's threaded through the entire story, beginning to end, and as far as I can tell, not many people involved ever clocked that at the time. Anyway, the story that's calcified over 50 years is that they performed an exorcism. What actually happened, in the man's own words, he gave everyone a blessing and specifically said he didn't want to increase anybody's anxiety by treating it like anything more than a run of bad luck. A calm, quiet blessing turned into, they had to exorcise the exorcism film. Even the true story about this film can't resist becoming more dramatic in the retelling. That's not a curse. That's just what humans do with an unexplained bad year. What's completely real and well documented, audiences fainting and vomiting in theaters on its release. When The Exorcist premiered in 1973, it sparked unprecedented mass hysteria. Audiences reportedly fainted, vomited, and fled the cinemas in sheer terror. Theaters even kept barf bags on hand and positioned ambulances outside to handle the overwhelmed moviegoers. The visceral reactions were largely driven by a combination of the film's blasphemous images, intense sound design, and graphic special effects. While the demonic possession scene involving pea soup, vomit, and head spinning are famous, many viewers actually fainted during a highly realistic, medically accurate scene depicting a cerebral angiography. Warner Brothers leaned into that in the marketing, because of course they did. A 9-month shoot. A huge cast and crew. Of course, there were injuries. Of course, statistically over that much time, there were deaths. What turned ordinary production chaos into the devil did this was the same thing that turned my own adolescence into a possession story. And the same thing that turned one woman's fabricated memoir into a national panic. We reach for the demon because the mundane explanation is somehow worse to sit with. So here's where all 3 of these threads actually meet. A 10-year-old reads a book and doesn't have language for what's happening to his body, so he borrows the language of possession instead. A country, that same year, doesn't have language for how ordinary and common real abuse actually is, so it invents a satanic conspiracy instead, because a conspiracy is somehow more bearable than the truth. And a film crew has a genuinely rough, unlucky shoot, and 50 years later, we'd still rather call it cursed than admit a director pushed those actors too hard. Every single one of those is the same movie. Take something real, something internal, something that doesn't have a tidy explanation, and give it a monster instead. I did it at 10. America did it in 1980. Hollywood mythology has been doing it about this film for 50 years. The difference is, I grew out of needing the monster. I know now what was actually happening to me that summer. And it wasn't possession. It was just a body and a heart doing what bodies and hearts do, with absolutely no instruction manual and nobody around to say it was going to be all right. The book didn't scare me into believing in demons. It scared me into recognizing one I already had. And it turns out it wasn't a demon at all. It never is. 6 years between a paperback and a television screen, a director who couldn't stop pulling the rope harder even when it broke a woman's back, a country that would rather believe in Satan than believing its own statistics, and one gay kid from small town South Carolina who came out the other side of it all wanting, more than anything, to learn how Dick Smith made movie magic. Spoiler, I never did reach the heights of Dick Smith's makeup artistry. But Universal Studios did eventually hire me to put latex on strangers and scare the hell out of tourists for a living. So I call that a result. Next time on Baz to the Bone, we're going to do something stupid. On purpose. After all these demonic shenanigans, I think we've earned it. We will be checking in on all the groovy guys and gals down at the beach. Party Beach, that is. We'll be diving headlong into 1964's The Horror of Party Beach. Man, this movie has it all. Mutant seaweed monsters, a rock and roll soundtrack, teenagers in matching windbreakers, and some of the least convincing dialogue committed to film in the entire decade. No metaphors, no childhood trauma, just a man in a rubber suit menacing a beach party. Sometimes that's the whole meal. If you want more of this, more horror, more cult film, more bad taste done properly, you can find the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're on Apple Podcast, remember that a review takes 30 seconds and genuinely helps more people find the show. If you want to support what we're doing here, Patreon is also available, and the link is in the show notes along with every film and every figure mentioned in the episode. I'm Baz, and this has been Baz to the Bone, where we do horror, cult film, and bad taste properly. Now go hug whatever 10-year-old version of yourself still needs it, and I'll see you in a fortnight.